Okay, it's 4 minutes past two, so I'm going to suggest that we get started. So, first of all, thanks everyone for attending this third educational in the series on James O'Toole's book, The Irish State and Revolution. And this is going to work just as the other ones have done. So James is going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then there'll be questions and answers at the end. And we're recording the James's talk, so the first part of this meeting, but then we won't be recording the discussion, so people can feel free to say what they want and ask questions and so on without having to worry about the recording. So this is organised by Rebel Telly and Red Network. So if you want to find out more information about who we are, there'll be details put into the chat, and also people can ask questions through the chat as well, and I will read them out to James after he has given his talk. So I'll hand it over to James.
Right, so this is basically about how the church came to dominate Ireland. And if people have any doubts about the church dominating Ireland, I mean, after repeal and stuff like that, people might think the church isn't relevant. But I mean, they were in the news last week talking about a new sex education curriculum that would tell children that sex was a gift from God and puberty was a gift from God. So not only is the church one of the biggest landowners in Ireland, they still have control of our schools and hospitals. And so it's still a very relevant topic. But it's also a relevant topic in terms of understanding the Irish state, because the church was one of the key institutions of the Irish state, and one of the key pillars in terms of holding working class people down. So, I mean, I want to start with a kind of a story that indicates how the church operated in Ireland in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. A young guy, 14-year-old Gerard Fogarty, arrived at his mother's door in the early hours of the morning, and his entire back was bleeding because he'd been whipped so severely that there was blood, pouring from the young guy's back. His clothes were drenched in blood. His mother tore her hair out. She was like, "How could this possibly happen?" They went down to a local Fianna Fáil TD's office and were like, look how this child has been treated. He'd just run away from an industrial school, and one of the members of the religious orders that ran the place had decided to beat him for wanting to go home. They took him down to the Shannon Estuary, made him stand in the salt water so that the salt water would get into the wounds to hurt the child. And you kind of think, well, what is it that explains that level of cruelty inflicted on working class, women, particularly women and children, by the church? Is it just to do with the religion? What is it that created the huge level of cruelty? There are a couple of reasons why the church came to dominate Irish politics, and why the kind of cruelty they inflicted on the working class was so intense, particularly in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think the first reason is the role of the British Empire and the church and their relationships to the British Empire. Before the Great Revolutionary Wolf Tone rose up in Belfast in 1798, actually the British oppressed the priests and bishops and the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, kind of had a little bit of they got some credentials from being oppressed. They were oppressed with people. But after the 1798 rebellion, the British Empire went from repressing the church to promoting the church, because the British Empire realized that the bishops and priests could help them to maintain their rule over Ireland, and that denouncing rebels from the pulpit was a good way to keep the people down. And so after the 1798 rebellion, the British set up the seminary in Maynooth, the priest training college and stuff like that, and the amount of priests increased massively. So that's the first point, is that the church, far from being, that there's some deep connection between the Catholic Church and the Irish people. In fact, the Catholic Church was willing to work with the oppressors of the Irish people in order to keep the majority of people down, because the British Empire then gave the church a privileged role. And in return, the British Empire got people who would denounce rebels from the pulpits at the Sunday sermons. So even before the Irish Revolution and counter-revolution and all the things we're going to talk about in a bit, the church was already playing a conservative role. The second thing that devastated the Irish people and gave the church more of a role over people's lives was the famine in the 1840s. That actually, not only did the famine destroy countless lives, you know, the British exported food, and you know, it was a manufactured situation in the sense that it wasn't because there was a shortage of food. The potato crop failed, but the reason the Irish were made to eat the potato was because the other crops were being exported. But that massively increased the power and domination of the Catholic Church, because not only did people have to go and, you know, beg for food at the feet of the priests and bishops, but also because it changed the nature of Irish farming. That after the famine, there was the rise of a bigger, kind of more wealthy tenant farmer class, as smaller, poorer people were kicked off the land, and, you know, lots of people died. And this wealthier tenant farmer class was really worried about their land being subdivided. And so you could see that they formed a relationship with the Catholic Church, because if you're worried about your land being subdivided, you're going to say to yourself, well, it's more profitable for me not to have kids. It's more profitable for me to have a really austere Catholic morality that restricts the number of kids you should have. It's really profitable for me not to subdivide the land amongst many kids, but to have as few kids as possible. So actually, after the famine, there was a rise of a kind of a middle layer of tenant farmers who grew into moderate wealth, you know, compared to the British landlords, but actually much wealthier than the people at the bottom of the pile. And this middle layer were actually the people who were more likely to send their sons to the priesthood and their daughters to the nuns' religious orders. And so what you had was that this really strict religious morality, you know, that you shouldn't have sex and you shouldn't have children, that actually matched the new circumstances of this layer of tenant farmers who wanted to restrict the amount of children they had so that they didn't subdivide their land. That actually then was the morality of the Catholic Church. And so it's not just about, you know, what people read in the Bible. It's not just about their religious beliefs. It's also trying to look at, you know, what class of people is constituting the priesthood. And I suppose the final ingredient explains why that class of people were so cruel towards working class people. And that's the revolution and counter-revolution. I mean, in the previous sessions, we've talked about how from 1918 to 1923, there were mass strikes. There was the Limerick Soviet. I mean, women joined Cumann na Ban, put rifles on their shoulders and, you know, fought for freedom. And the upper class people like Kevin O'Higgins, who ended up leading the forming the Irish state after the Irish Revolution, these people explicitly said, we need to bring the era of social flux to an end. In other words, thanks very much to the working class for kicking the empire out, but now that you've done that job, get back into the slums, get back into the factories and do what you're told by us, the Irish rich. In other words, we've kicked out the old boss, we've kicked out the old landlord, but welcome to a society run by your new boss and your new landlord, who'd wrap themselves in the tricolour to keep the Irish people down. And so understanding that the Irish Revolution and kicking out the empire had destabilised Ireland. It had actually thrown things up in the air. There was the possibility of the revolution going further, especially when workers in Limerick took over Limerick and ran it themselves for 2 months in what's called the Limerick Soviet. You know, there was a potential for workers to actually keep pushing the fight against the empire forward until it became a fight against the slum landlords and the factory owners, until it actually became a fight for socialism. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And as punishment, there was a French revolutionary, Saint-Just. He once said that those who half make a revolution may as well dig their own graves. And so the Irish working class, as punishment for not going all the way, was actually penalised by the Irish ruling class. The Irish ruling class understood the revolutionary potential of the Irish working class. So far from it being the case that the conservative Ireland of the 20s, 30s, and 40s was some product of an inherent conservatism and Catholicism inherent in some kind of aspect of the nature of the Irish people. Actually, the role of the church was part and parcel of a whole package of measures that were put in place to defend a new elite, an Irish elite, that was taking the place of the British and needed to beat the working class of Ireland into submission. And so it's in that context that you understand that in 1924, there were more children imprisoned in Ireland in industrial schools and in doing slave labor on farms like Artane, where there was 800 kids working on the 200 or more than 200 acre farm. There were more kids imprisoned in Ireland than were imprisoned in the whole of England, the whole of Scotland, the whole of Northern Ireland, and the whole of Wales put together. And that only makes sense. It only makes sense when you have a ruling class that's trying to put down a revolutionary working class. In other words, if the Irish working class hadn't been so revolutionary, it would have been easy to put us back in the box. But think about the amount of violence it takes to put a radicalized working class back in a box. I mean, after the German Revolution of 1918 to 23, when that failed, the German ruling class turned to people like Hitler to beat the German working class back into a box. In other words, the more militant you are and the more you fight, the more the rich will push you back into a box. And I think it's in that context that you understand all those ingredients. The church had been working as a pillar of the establishment, as the representative of the wealthy since the days of the British Empire. The famine had increased the power and legitimacy of the church in the eyes of many people. The church had become the spokesperson of a layer of very wealthy farmers who had a very strict and austere morality that they wanted to impose on the rest of the people, particularly poor people in the countryside and the working class of the cities. And then that middle to rich layer of people that made up the clergy were then asked by the Golden Circle to beat the people into submission. And they did it with relish. And so actually, if you think about it, obviously religion plays a role in terms of motivating people, and people contextualize their actions in terms of the ideas in their heads. But it's not just a particularly nasty reading of the Bible that motivated Bishop McQuaid and these people to be so ruthless in their punishment of the Irish people. It was that class element. It was about a ruling class intent on keeping us down. And I think that's the key thing to understand. Revenge. Revenge was the motivation for child rape, for the Magdalene laundries, for all these terrible things that they did, because they wanted revenge, because it came from a place of fear. The ruling class were afraid of what the working class was capable of. And from that place of deep-rooted fear and existential dread that Connolly's dream could have come true. Connolly's dream of socialism to these people was a nightmare. And that nightmare for them could have come true. Our dream is their nightmare. And so they wanted to take revenge to keep us down. It's in that context that you understand a priest taking a 14-year-old child, whipping him till his back is bare to the bone, making him stand in the estuary of the Shannon River so that the salt would hurt his wounds, so the child would know what a little sinner he was. That the element of class revenge explains the brutality and ruthlessness of what was done to us. So I wanted to finally, in the last few minutes, talk about, well, how did this ruthless state, we talked previously about the role of the Gardaí beating up people, the role of the Guards in terms of the post-Civil War situation that, undermining workers' rights, how the Free State Army went and evicted people from occupied workplaces. So you could see that all the different institutions of the Irish state were polluted by this period of revolution and counter-revolution, that the state was formed in this period of flux. And it was a machine that was built to serve the ruling class, and the church was one of the pillars of this machinery of state. And so, Karl Marx once said that religion is the opium of the people. But actually, he wasn't being condescending. Sometimes that's quoted out of context to mean that Marx was kind of being condescending, kind of saying like, oh, religion is the opium of the people. People are stupid, aren't they? They're duped by religion. But actually, what he was actually saying is that what is it about the world we live in that makes people require opium? In other words, if the world is such a terrible place that people long for a better place beyond the clouds, then Marx's question was, if religion is the opium of the people, why did the people require opium? And so religion is contradictory. In other words, there are people in South America who are against fascist dictatorships, fought against the kind of regime we saw in Ireland, established in Ireland in the 20s, 30s and 40s. There are people who religion motivated them to fight against that kind of regime. We've seen like people like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, where their religious beliefs were part and parcel of a project of, either political reform or political revolution. And so religion is contradictory. It plays a contradictory role and can be found on both sides of the barricades. But the reason religion played the role it did in Ireland isn't to be found in analysing the Bible. It's to be found in the class nature of the church, the class nature of the Irish state, and the political project of revenge that the ruling class and its institutions embarked upon in the years following the establishment of the Irish state. And so if you understand that, you understand that it's not enough to say, hey, the way to oppose Catholicism is to be an extreme atheist, or the way to oppose Catholicism is to, tell everyone how, some particular fact in the Bible didn't happen. That's not what it's about. What it's about is actually getting people to understand the role the church played as a political institution. But in the 1960s, Ireland opened up to, corporations from all around the world. The economy began to open up, and the kind of irrational, and what I mean by irrational systems of control is that capitalism likes to give the appearance of being a natural system. They rule through, Antonio Gramsci pointed out that they rule through force and consent. In other words, they try to convince you that it's all good and, this is the only system and there is no alternative. And when that breaks down, they use force. And so from the point of view of the system, the Irish mechanisms of control, the brutalization of women in the Magdalen laundries, the rape and beating and abuse of children, is kind of irrational because it gives the game away. That naked force reveals the system for what it is. It was obvious in the early years of the Irish state that it was a machine that was holding working class people down, because it was obviously evicting people from occupied factories. It was obviously firing guns over the heads of striking postal workers. It was obvious what the state was doing when they were applying force in such an obvious way. And so the change in the economy in the 1960s required more rational systems of control. The state is still a machine for controlling working class people, but they required a more rational system of control. But the problem is that often the old power structures don't automatically evolve when the economy evolves. In other words, corporations come in and are like, Jesus, Ireland needs to modernise. You need to give people secondary school education. Not because the corporations are kind, but because the corporations understand that an educated workforce is more profitable in terms of employing them to do the things corporations want them to do. But the church didn't want to give ground on education. Look at how they fought people like Noel Brown. Well, Noel Brown wanted healthcare for mothers and children. The man had spent a lot of time trying to fight TB in the slums, and was a genuine person who wanted reforms for working class people. But the church fought him tooth and nail. So in other words, sometimes economic changes, demand certain changes in the political structures, but these things never happen automatically. And when you have that tension between the need for a change in the power structure and a power structure that won't give way, often resistance is vital in terms of actually delivering that change. So far from it being the case that the capitalist economy and capitalist power structures kind of harmonize as the economy evolves, actually power structures from one period hang on as the economy evolves, and they won't give way. And that often leads then to, explosions of resistance and explosions of protest, because there's no other way for people to actually vent their desire for change. And I want to say that it's Irish women who were actually most punished by the revolution, by the counter-revolution, in the Magdalen laundries and through the morality that the Irish ruling class used to keep us down. But it was actually Irish women who played a role in liberating us from the church, because the employment of women massively increased from the 60s all the way through to the 1990s. And I think that employment by women and campaigns by women, campaigns for contraception, campaigns for divorce, campaigns for access to terminations, for abortion, I think that growing participation by women in the workforce led to women saying, well, it's completely irrational for me to have no control over my life. It's completely irrational for me to have no say in my own, reproductive cycle, in terms of when I want to have children, if I have children or don't have children. And so women, didn't want to accept the old morality anymore. And I mean, the Eighth Amendment in 1983 was really the church understanding that they were being weakened by these economic changes. They were being weakened by the modernization of the Irish economy. And the insertion of the Eighth Amendment was about the church trying to push back, trying to keep some hold over, political control over the Irish people. And in the end, it was actually massive campaigns by women. The X case in the 1990s, schoolgirls walked out of school to join massive demonstrations in the city centre that eventually led to the erosion of the church. And it's in the context of all those protests that people felt empowered to start revealing their stories in the 1990s. I don't think it's any coincidence that participation by women in the workforce reaches a high in the 1990s, resistance on the streets reaches a high in the 1990s, and the revelation of all these terrible scandals about mass graves and all these things start to become revealed in the 1990s. The final thing I wanted to end on was that the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael had often been tied to the Catholic Church because those parties, those landlord parties, as parties of the ruling class, understood the church helped them keep control over the people. We see in 2008, when the banking crisis hit, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael lost a lot of their support base. I mean, Fianna Fáil had used nationalism and the promise of housing and things like that, and clientelism to build up a working class support base, but they lost it after the banking crisis. And so actually realizing that the working class, particularly working class women, wanted a more modern Ireland. They wanted, marriage equality repeal. Women wanted those things, particularly in the working class areas where the votes for those things is evidence of there was a demand for modernization, and people wanted to get away from the old Ireland of church control. The ruling class, losing votes because of austerity, embraced the modernization agenda, but they only did it half-heartedly. I mean, Leo Varadkar is a deeply conservative person. Micheál Martin and the grassroots of Fianna
I think James might be gone there. James, are you there? We're having some issues with our internet here, which is why I had my video off.
It's back now,
Oh,
but
you're
I got kicked out of
you
the
got kicked out.
Yeah.
Sorry. And
Anyway,
you're about to finish, so
Yeah, so the final point is that kind of takes us up today, that actually, changes in the economy, changes in the kind of, that capitalism actually prefers you to believe that the system is rational, and the old methods of control in the from the counter-revolutionary years from the 20s and 30s didn't work anymore. But actually, in order to actually win those changes, it took mass resistance by working class people, particularly women. And that's where we are today. We're still in a country where the church has, over 90% of the schools. They run the hospitals. They're still one of the biggest landowners in the country. They have massive amounts of land upon which we could build social housing. And I suppose the final thing I wanted to say was just to read the conclusion of the chapter on the church in the book, where it says that the church is one of the biggest landowners in this state and still controls much of our health and education system. They were able to dominate Irish life for decades because of the aid they gave to the counter-revolutionary state in keeping the Irish people on our knees. They made us hate ourselves. They filled us with guilt and doubt. Many families are still dealing with PTSD from these generations of abuse. The Catholic Church was a pillar of Irish capitalism. It needs to be broken as part of undermining that rotten system. Worship should be a private affair. It should be completely separated from the state. A socialist revolution would take the land from the church and use it for public good. The schools and hospitals would be out of church hands, and the free, secular education system would help to empower people who would no longer suffer from alienation and want, and could begin to dream of building a paradise here on earth rather than in the sky. And I think I'll leave it there.
thanks very much, James, for that. That's really excellent.